So it really is a pleasure to invite Professor François Bourguignon here to talk about poverty. Professor Bourguignon is from Paris. He's a professor of economics in Paris School of Economics. He's one of the leading experts in the area of poverty and inequality. His work is global, and he looks at poverty and inequality in both undeveloped and developed countries. And I think there are many people here who are really interested in what you're going to tell us. And I'm very happy to ask you to the podium and share with us your things. Just before you start, I'd like to mention that the arrangement of today will be that after a lecture from Professor Bourguignon, we'll have few of our professors presenting their issue. We'll have a short panel, then we're going to have a break and a symposium with Professor Heckman that will give the center lecture, and then again, presentation of many of our professors, a panel, and a surprise for the end. So let's see if I put the right one.
And this is working, yes. Okay, thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. And thank you very much for this kind introduction. It is a pleasure to be here and to be talking about, of course, what is my favorite topic in economics, which is about poverty, and maybe I will also say a few things about inequality. The presentation I will make is very much influenced by the fact that over the last couple of weeks, I've been working in connection with my colleague and other Dan David Prize laureate, Tony Atkinson, who could not make it to Tel Aviv, on a report which is about measuring global poverty. And it's always very difficult to get out of what you are working on at one point of time. But in thinking about what I would be talking about today, I thought that it would be a good idea to start from this work or this reflection that we have, because when you go through measurement issues, you have to look at conceptual definition, conceptual problems. And whether you talk about global poverty or you talk about national poverty, the concepts are very similar, so that in my review of the issues linked to global poverty, many of the remarks I will make will apply at the national level. Now, it may also be a little odd to talk about measurement. This seems to be a very technical aspect. But I believe that people who say that you only do well what you can measure well are right. And if we want to think to design policies which will address effectively poverty, I think that it is quite important that the thermometer that we have to measure poverty and the change in poverty is as accurate as possible. And in particular, this will avoid the kind of debate that we are used to in our various countries. Anytime that statistics is being published, then some people will say, we don't believe that these statistics reflect accurately the reality. So to make sure that we are able to avoid this kind of debate is really very important. So when we talk about global poverty, what are we talking about, and what is the way in which today we are measuring global poverty? And what is quite interesting is the fact is we talk about global poverty in a very crude way to some extent. How is it defined? We define poverty with, or we measure poverty in two ways. First, we have to define a threshold under which we will decide that people can be considered as poor. This threshold will be defined in the space of monetary dimensions of well-being, and essentially this will be corresponding to consumption per person. And today, the United Nations and the World Bank, which is responsible for the measurement of global poverty, are using this definition. Poverty is defined as a level of consumption per day and per capita, which is equal to $1.90 US. But be very cautious in the way in which you interpret this measure. This is after correcting the official exchange rate for something we call purchasing power parity, so that we are taking into account the very, very important fact, which is the following. You start from New York with $1 in your pocket. If you want to spend that dollar in New York, you'll be buying something, some goods, some services. You fly to Delhi. You change your dollar in Delhi for rupees, and you'll get 66 rupees for your dollar in Delhi. And you try to buy the same thing in Delhi as you were buying in New York. And then you realize that you'll be able to buy 3 times more in Delhi than what you were able to buy in New York. Why? Simply because prices in Delhi are lower than prices in New York. So we have to take into account that the same basket of goods doesn't have the same price in different countries after we have converted those local currencies into a common currency, which would be the dollar or the euro, whatever. And this $1.90 US a day must be interpreted as indeed the purchasing power of $1.90 in a developed country today. So now you can imagine what it means. Let's say that instead of 1.90, it would be 2. It would be $60 per person a month. If I'm not mistaken, the poverty line today in Israel is something like 10 times higher than that, a little less than 10 times higher than that. So you can see that this is really, we're talking about a level of poverty which is very, very, very low. This is something we call extreme poverty, and it is believed, but I'll come back to that a little later, that below that level it is indeed very difficult to survive. And the second component of the measurement is, of course, the number of people below that threshold, or the proportion of people below that threshold. Today we have more or less 10% of, little more than 10% of the global population below that level. And I'll say a little more about the way in which that figure has been changing over time. So these are the basic ingredients of poverty measurement at the global level. And if you go to any country at one point of time, you'll find exactly the same thing. If you go to the US and ask about what is the absolute monetary limit below which people are considered as being poor, then you'll be quoted a figure which will depend on the size of the family or whether the number of children, etc. And then you'll be told that there are so many of this percentage, if certain percent, if I remember well, people in poverty in the US. So because of that, I think this is something which is of a very general application. Now, what I want to do in this presentation is to go over several problems linked to this definition, and to show you that things are below the surface much more complicated, much more difficult than what this simple definition would suggest. So I will, in turn, consider the following issues. I will be talking about purchasing power parities, what we have to think about them, and the comparison with another acronym here, which is a CPI, CPI being for Consumer Price Index, And I'll try to insist on the difference between purchasing power parities and consumer price indices. Then why $1.90 a day per person at the global level? Then some words about the availability, reliability, and comparability of national household surveys on which we rely in order to measure the number of people below the poverty line. Then I'll be talking about other lines and other measures, and I will finish up with some remarks on going beyond an absolute and a monetary definition of poverty. There was a lot of discussion at the time the United Nations were preparing the Sustainable Development Goals, a lot of discussion about what should be the definition of poverty, and many of the issues I will be talking about under this E item will be corresponding to this discussion. Okay, let me start with this PPP. And let me say first that I will be discussing PPPs, purchasing power parities, in an international context, trying to compare the purchasing power in different countries. But I would like to insist right at the beginning that this issue is also a national issue. When we measure, when we try to compare within a country the level of real income or the purchasing power that people have, and we want to make a distinction between various places in the country, we have to take into account that it does not cost the same thing to live in Tel Aviv or to live, let's say, in Beersheba. And in all countries of the world, you have huge differences. I mean, in France, people living in Paris, of course, are facing a purchasing power which is, for the same amount of money, a purchasing power which is much lower than their relatives who are living in some village in the Loire Valley. And this is really what PPPs internationally are trying to do. And we should have, within countries, systematically indices telling us or allowing us to compare the cost of living in different parts of the country. And unfortunately, this is a statistic which is very rarely available. And from that point of view, I would like to insist on the fact that if we want to be serious about this, we should take into account the spatial differences in cost of living. Now, at the international level, what does happen? There are people, organizations, which are collecting prices in all countries in the world in order to compare the cost of living in those countries. The last survey, I mean, ICP stands for the International Comparison Program. Implicitly, it is the International Comparison Program for Prices. And the way in which it works is the following. Last wave was in 2011. They worked in 199 countries in the world. They had a list of 100,000 core goods and services, and they collected prices on various markets within each country, in particular making a distinction between rural and urban. Then they compared the total cost of some baskets of goods and services. So I will not insist on the difficulty of the exercise, because ideally you like to compare the same basket of goods in various countries. But because countries do not have the same the same consumption behavior, then you cannot do things like that. In the old days, one of the first wave of this ICP program, in the basket, the common basket of goods, one good was a bottle of Bordeaux. But of course, when you are in Mali, at the middle of Mali, and you ask, by the way, what is a bottle of Bordeaux around here? Then of course, there is no bottle of Bordeaux around. I mean, if you want to buy a Bordeaux, you have to travel 100 kilometers to go to Bamako, and maybe in Bamako you'll find this bottle, which will be, as a matter of fact, very expensive. So the big difficulty that those statisticians are meeting is the fact that you have to make comparison of purchasing power, taking into account differences in consumption behavior. So they design different methodologies, and what is problematic is the fact that until now, more or less each wave of the International Comparison Program is using a different methodology to make the comparison, so that those various waves are not completely comparable over time. And I'll come back to that in just a moment, because this is really very problematic. This is what is mentioned here in the item, methodological changes from a wave to another. The most elaborated waves were in 1993, 2005, 2011. They cannot do that every year because it is a very expensive operation, so they do it only from time to time. And the other problem that we have, and again, this is a problem which is not a problem for only international comparison, it is also a problem for national poverty measurement, is that the price indices, the purchasing power parity that they compute are for a national account aggregate. It is essentially to measure the gross domestic product or to measure the aggregate consumption of households. And it is not really directed toward a particular group of people within the society. But we know that poor people do not consume the same things as other people. They do not consume the same thing. They do not consume the same quantities as other people. And if you are really poor, the fact that you will be buying rice every day, a few hundred grams of rice every day, whereas if you had a little more money, you could buy a sack, a 5 or 10 kilos sack, the difference in the price of the two is substantial. So this means that we probably are missing something quite important when we are assuming that the price index or the purchasing power parity is the same for everybody in society. And this is one of the big issues at the international level today, trying to think about a methodology to have a purchasing power parity which apply to poor people. Okay, sorry about this. There is an equation. I mean, I think that this might not be the spirit of those presentations. It is a very simple one. And I think it is, you will understand exactly what the problem is. We have a problem of time consistency with these PPPs, which is the following, which is the fact that PPPs, purchasing power parities, and consumer price indices estimated, measured within one country are not telling us the same thing about the way in which prices have changed within a country. Why? Simply because the basket of goods on which the purchasing power parity of the International Comparison Program are based and the basket of goods on which the local consumption price index is based are not the same. In Ghana, for example, the local consumption price index is based on a basket of goods of 200 products, whereas the ICP leading to the purchasing power parities is based on a set of 500 goods. And because of that, when you are comparing the evolution of prices in Ghana between 2005, last time there were the PPP, and 2011, and the evolution of the consumption price index, you don't find the same result. And this is what is in the formula that you have here. Before the 1.90 US dollars in purchasing power of 2011, the poverty line was 0.25 US dollars at the purchasing power parity of 2005. And this calculation that we have here shows you what was the transformation on this 1.25 when updating this to 2011. And the calculation is the following. You start from $1.25 a day, you multiply by the purchasing power parity in country I in 2005. Then you got something which is in local currency. Now you update this amount in local currency, let's say in rupees in India, looking at the inflation as indicated by the consumer price index or the ratio between 2011 and 2005. So this gives you the new local currency poverty line in 2011. And now if you want to go back to local common currency, to the dollar, you divide by the purchasing power parity in 2011. So this is the operation that you do. And at the end, you have 1.25 multiplied by something here called alpha sub I. And you can see that this alpha sub I is simply the comparison between the change in price as indicated by the consumption price index and the change in price as indicated by the purchasing power parity. This alpha I has absolutely no reason to be equal to 1 to, alpha I has no reason to be the same for all countries. What does that mean? This means that because of the discrepancy between local measurement of inflation and the international measurement of inflation through the purchasing power parity, we have some discrepancies across country in the way in which poverty is being measured. In some cases, this may be extremely serious. When I was in the World Bank, when I left the World Bank, and I was very happy to leave the World Bank exactly at that moment, because we just discovered with the PPPs, in those days it was the PPPs 2005, we had to tell the Chinese, look, you know what? You are much poorer than what we thought. Basically because we had a revision of the PPP. And so we have to tell them you have 200 million more people than what we thought. But be reassured, the drop in poverty is more or less the same as what we had discussed before. And so, of course, the Chinese were not very happy to know that they had more poor people than what everybody thought. But quite strangely enough, a few months ago, when the 2011 purchasing power parity were published, then my successor in the World Bank had to tell the Chinese, you know what? You are much richer than what we thought before. And this is simply because they had corrected between 2005 and 2011 some problems that they had in the measurement of prices in the International Comparison Program in China. In 2005, they simply underestimated or undersampled prices in rural areas. In 2011, they corrected that. And because of that, of course, if you simply ignore the rural areas, the way in which you are estimating poverty does not make very much sense when we know that poverty tends to concentrate precisely in rural areas. So this is something very important. And again, this is reinforcing what I was saying at the beginning. This issue, it is an international issue, but it is also a national issue. Okay, now let me say something about how we got to this 1.25 or $1.90 a day. And this is a very interesting story of the way in which clever academics can generate an international norm. And I'll tell you why. The poverty line is 1.25 at the purchasing power of 2005, or the new 0.90, is defined in the following way. This is something which has been invented by a colleague, Martin Ravalian, and some colleagues of his. They wanted to measure international poverty. They had to invent an international poverty line. And what they said, okay, let's look at the official poverty line in a sample of developing countries. And if we find that all those poverty lines are above some floor, then we can decide that this floor is what you need to survive. And this is what they do, and here is the kind of sample that they got. What you have on the total axis is simply the GDP or per capita, or the log of consumption per person in various countries. And on the vertical axis, you have the official poverty line in those countries after converting to international purchasing power parities. And you see what you have in the red circle is the bottom of this. And we see that we have a rising relationship between the poverty line and the level of affluence in the country, except at the bottom where we have a kind of horizontal floor. And they say, let's look at those countries, and let's say that the mean of the poverty line in those countries is what we should use as an international poverty line. And this is what they did. They did that a long time ago. This was, the first paper was published in 1990. And because the world became more and more interested in global poverty, this became the way to function. And this $1.25 a day became, initially it was $1 a day, then it became 1.25, then now it is 1.90, as we are updating and as prices are changing across years. But this is the way in which the measure was, the poverty line was decided. Now, the World Bank decided to keep that definition, even though the countries you find at the bottom may not always be the same. In the 1990s, early 1990s, or in the 80s more exactly, at the bottom you would have found China and you would have found India. But China and India now are much above that. And the countries, they are right at the bottom, but you cannot read them. But most of the countries there are African countries today. And then it was decided by the World Bank and by the United Nations that they would keep that line. Now, the point I want to emphasize here, the fact that there is something very arbitrary in doing that. Maybe those poverty lines in countries like Mali or Sierra Leone are much too low, and there is a need to rethink probably about that definition. This was a trick invented by researchers, and as I said, this trick became the official norm internationally. Okay, because I'm short of time, maybe I will go very quickly about this. These are the various steps, updatings, which took place in this measurement of global poverty. You have right at the beginning the ancestor of this, which is in 1979, which was a paper by Ahluwalia, where they started that. They decided that the international poverty line would be the India poverty line, and they worked with a reduced number of countries. And over time, the methodology to estimate the poverty line evolved, the methodology for the purchasing power parities evolved, the number of countries on which the poverty line was defined evolved, and this is more or less the story of the updatings of the international poverty line. But let me move on. This is, I could not leave that without showing you the evolution of global poverty. So this is over time, between 1985 and 2000, the last point must be 2010. You have the top solid line is the evolution of the number of poor people in the world. So you see that you go from 2 billion people in the end of the 80s to today less than 1 million more exactly 800 million poor people, according to this $1.90 a day. The dotted line corresponds to what was observed using the previous poverty line, which was the $1.25 a day at the purchasing power parity of 2005. So you see that, somehow I made a mistake in my graphs, and I didn't take the right one, and it stops in 2005. It should go until 2010, but the difference is really very small when we get to 2010. What we see here, the fact that any time that there is an updating in the poverty line, there is a change in the global estimate of poverty, which is really problematic, because when you are the United Nations, when you are the World Bank, and suddenly you tell people, look, the number of poor people was so much, but from now on, it is so much. Then there is an issue of credibility here, and this is the reason why the state of affairs is not completely satisfactory to have this kind of change taking place. This is at the global level. We have changes also taking place at the national level, and again, it is not very comfortable to have to tell people, to tell countries or governments, we changed the estimate of poverty in your country. And the way in which both the United Nations and the World Bank function, that when they make a change, they change the whole series. So that from a day to the next, you cannot find what were the old figures. So this is really quite problematic, and this is the reason why the bank asked Tony Atkinson to lead this commission to think about what should be done about this. And what you have at the bottom is the evolution of poverty by region. The brown curve corresponds to East Asia, and of course includes China. And so you can see that very much of what has happened at the global level is really due to China and to East Asia. And what is of special concern is what we see here, this purple curve, which corresponds to Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, where you see that the number of poor people in sub-Saharan Africa has barely changed between over the last 25 or more than that, almost, yes, 25 years. And this is problematic because behind that you also have the increase in the population in Africa. But I thought it was important to show you this. Now let me move to some comments on all this. Maybe I should not spend too much time on the statistics, except to mention that we have made a lot of progress in taking household surveys, but in many countries we have very scarce surveys, and it is problematic to extrapolate the few surveys which are available in order to get an estimate at one point of time. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that I would like to insist on more substantial points. One thing I think is quite important is that it is quite surprising for people who are good statisticians to produce a figure about the global poverty without any kind of standard deviation of the estimate. So we say today the number of poor people is 800 million, but we know that this is imprecise. And there are many, many reasons why we have this imprecision. I mean, not only those PPPs and kind of story, but for example, in some countries, we don't even know very well what the population of the country is. So we take a survey. In the sample, we say the proportion of poor people is so much. Then we have this estimate of the total population of the country. We multiply, and this gives us the number of poor people in the country. But the population figure itself may not be completely reliable. So what do we do with that? I mean, I think it is quite essential to be able to say, to give an interval of confidence for what we are producing as an estimate, and in particular to be able to say something about whether the changes that are being observed are significant or not significant. And let me simply, because of time, go to the last point that I wanted to mention, which is much more conceptual, and I believe will probably be discussed later on today. You see that the definition of poverty that is being used at the global level, and is also used in some countries, in particular the United States, is a monetary measure of poverty, absolute, in terms, meaning that this figure, this line, doesn't change when the economy, when the society is evolving. So here we have this $1.90 a day. The global economy is increasing. The average income in the world is increasing, and yet we don't change the poverty line. Now, in Israel, like in Europe, you have a different view of poverty. We tend to define poverty in relative terms. We say poverty are the people who are below 50%, 60% of the median income per capita or income per consumption unit that is observed in the country. And this is a relative line, which is changing over time. And many people are objecting to the fact that in a world where there is economic growth, we cannot consider that the poverty line always remains the same, that we should also have a relative poverty line. And there have been some suggestions, This is taken from an old paper that we wrote with Atkinson, where we are trying to say that one thing we could do is to merge, to combine the two views about the absolute and relative poverty line. What you have here that on the vertical axis you have the individual income, and the horizontal line at the middle is the absolute poverty line. On the horizontal axis you have GDP per capita, so that in the left-hand side of the graph you have poor countries, and on the right-hand side you would have intermediate countries, income countries, or maybe even rich countries. Now, people below the absolute poverty line are absolutely poor. But if we want to combine that with the concept of relative poverty, then we could look at people who are also poor, not poor in absolute terms, but poor in relative terms. And this is a small triangle that we have at the, on the right-hand side. So that all this area, the rectangle plus the triangle, would be a measure of poverty, something we call the societal measure of poverty, that takes into account, on the one hand, that we don't want to have people below some absolute level which corresponds to survival, and on the other hand, we want to take into account the fact that people don't want to be too far away from where their population, or where the way in which income in their population is faring. So this is a proposal, and this is, I guess, something that will have to be considered in the future. By the way, the relative poverty line, as it is practiced in Israel and in Europe, has some problems. In Europe, at the time of the recession in 2009, some people said, look, poverty went down, despite the fact that incomes went down, which was really very, very surprising. Then when this was published in the press, people said, how come? We have a drop in by 2-3% of GDP and personal income, and you are telling us that poverty is going down. And it was going down because it was compared to the 50% of the median. Everybody had a drop in income, and because the drop was slightly less for the poor people, then poverty was going down. So then we invented two poverty. We said, now we have to look at poverty as conventionally measured in relative terms, and something that we called anchored poverty. So 2007 anchored poverty, saying that we will be measuring poverty using the relative poverty line, which was operational in 2007. So that with respect to that measure, of course, poverty had increased. So this means that it is not that clear that you should look at one side or the other. The reality is slightly more complicated. Another thing that is important is to take into account horizontal inequality in poverty, and the fact that not all groups in a society are equally concerned or hit by poverty. We know that women in general and children there are more women and children than men, adult men, living in poor households. Unfortunately, and this is the third point, we cannot do very much to look at what is going on within the household, even though we know that a lot of things is going on. We know that when we look at anthropometric measures of boys versus girls in some countries, we know that the measures for girls are much less favorable than for boys. This means that there is something going on within the household, meaning that not everybody is sharing in an equal way what is available in the household. But we don't have enough and systematic information on this to go much beyond that. Also, you have noticed that we are talking about $1.90 per person and a day, but what about taking into account the size of the family, the composition of the family, the age composition of the members of the family? So why not take into account consumption units rather than persons? We are in developed countries very used to use consumption units. Why don't we do it systematically at the global level? The reason for that is that to go from number of people to consumption units, you have to take into account the consumption behavior within the country, and there is a lot of diversity. And let me conclude with this non-monetary dimension. And this is really what has been very, very much discussed at the time there was a discussion about the Sustainable Development Goals. The fact that we cannot consider that the only thing which matters in terms of poverty is the income or your purchasing power. It matters very much whether you are socially excluded or included. It matters a lot whether you have access to education, whether you have access to health care, whether you are living in a secure environment, whether you are living in a polluted area or not. All these are considered as important dimensions of poverty, which are not at all represented by the $1.90 a day. A lot of work has been done in trying to design multidimensional poverty measures. There is, in particular, now this work done by Al-Khairi and Foster and applied in the United Nations, what they call the multidimensional poverty index, where they are counting the number of deprivations in different areas. Deprivation in terms of food, but also deprivation in terms of education, in terms of healthcare, etc. And certainly this gives a much better description of what poverty may be. And today we also are using more and more subjective data, and this is again a line of research that could be developed. So I have only one small slide of conclusion. I can only encourage you to look at the Atkinson report when it will be out in a few weeks, and really, which is really covering all the areas and making recommendations in all the areas which I have mentioned. Again, it is quite interesting to see that an ingenious researcher idea was transformed into a global social norm, and at the same time we understand that it would have been needed to do more reflection on the way in which to define poverty. And I will simply finish going back in time. In the 80s, the buzzword in development economics when we are talking about poverty was basic needs. And then you had in those days people trying to figure out what was the cost of a minimum diet for people to survive. What was the cost of acquiring so many calories, so many proteins, so many minerals, etc., etc. And they were trying to base a poverty line on this. I think there is a huge difference between what I've presented here, this, what is behind this $1.90 a day, and this kind of approach. And I would like simply to conclude on saying that maybe going back to a kind of basic need approach to measuring poverty would probably be a good idea if we can overcome the problems that we had in those days. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.